Okay. Right, good evening. Okay. The topic for this evening is about radiometric methods. Okay. Okay, this is just a brief discussion on geophysical methods which focus on the radioactive properties or radioactive behavior of materials. Okay. Before we start, we have to have a refresher on atoms. Okay. Okay. Atoms, for example, in this format, okay, usually represented by atoms comprise right the matter, okay, in the universe, and okay, we have different elements, right, and each element will have an atom. For example, a carbon atom, C. Okay, it will usually have two numbers, the atomic number and the atomic mass. Okay. The atomic number is defined as the number of protons, okay, orbit in the atom. Okay. Protons are inside the nucleus. Okay. So an atom is like a it's like the solar system, no? The nucleus is like you can imagine the nucleus as the sun, and you have orbiting particles. Sorry, they have you have electrons which are orbiting around the nucleus. Now, protons are actually the most important constituent if we are talking about the identity of the element. Okay. The number of protons define what kind of element you have. Okay. For example, carbon will have an atomic number of 6. Okay. Once you change the atomic number, this element will shift into another type of element. Okay. Therefore, atomic number or the number of protons serve as the proxy for the identity of the atom or element. Atomic mass is the number of protons plus the number of neutrons per atom. Okay. So this one, okay. Wait lang. Hey, atomic mass is protons plus neutrons. Okay. Okay. The significance of atomic mass is this one defines the identity of the isotopes, okay, of an element. Okay, let's talk about isotopes I think probably in the next slide. Okay. Isotopes are always reckoned with respect to an element. For example, carbon will have variants, okay, which are distinguished by their atomic mass. Okay. So you have carbon 12, carbon 13, carbon 14. Okay. These are carbons with different atomic weights or atomic masses. Okay. For example, carbon 12 has 6 neutrons plus 6 electrons or 12 atomic weight. Carbon 13, again, the same. You have 13 as the sum of your number of protons plus neutrons, 6 plus 7. And then for carbon 14, you have 6 plus 8, 14 atomic weight. Okay, but these are all, okay, they have different atomic weights, but they all identify as carbon because they have the same number of protons. Okay, okay, so again, isotopes are like the variants of an element. Okay? They have the same atomic number or the same number of protons, but they have different atomic no, atomic masses or atomic weights. Okay, right? And isotopes are usually formed through radioactive processes. Okay. But for now, let's talk about the naming of isotopes. Okay. The convention for naming isotopes usually is the letter of the element and then dash the atomic weight. Okay. So uranium has an atomic number of 92. This is the identifier, or this defines the identity, okay, of the element. So we also have, okay, 238 is the atomic weight. Okay, so you have uranium has isotopes. The most commonly discussed isotopes of uranium are uranium 238 and uranium 235. Okay, these are the radioactive or unstable isotopes of uranium. Okay. Now, note some naming schemes or some symbol schemes will flip the atomic weight and the atomic number. So you just have to look for the bigger number. Usually the bigger number would be the atomic weight and the smaller number would be the atomic number. Okay. And there are, sorry,
Sir, excuse me po. Naka-pause po yata screen sharing niya po.
okay na. Sorry. Okay. And we have different modes of radioactive decay. We have alpha decay, we have beta decay, and gamma, and electron capture. Actually, there's a few more modes of radioactive decay, but we're just gonna be talking about the four modes of radioactivity. Okay. Let's start with alpha decay. We have two protons and two neutrons are ejected. Okay. So you have yeah, you basically lose, okay, uh the atomic weight of the element is reduced by 4, okay, because you lose two protons and two neutrons. Okay. And take note, in alpha decay you lose protons, therefore there will be a change in the identity of the element. Okay. The most One of the most, or probably the most relevant example here is the decay of radon, or Rn. Radon has an atomic number of 86, or 86 protons. When it loses two protons, its atomic number changes to 84 and it becomes or transforms or transmutes into polonium. Okay. Radon is a hazardous gas. Okay, it's a hazardous gas. Let's talk about later on about the hazards of radon. Polonium is also a highly hazardous element. This is used usually for, I think this is used for assassinations, in the defunct Soviet Union, and by usually this is a favorite weapon by Russian agents. Okay. Anyway, for alpha decay, okay, two protons and two neutrons essentially is just a helium-4, okay, nucleus. Okay. So that's why we represent the particle, the alpha particle, sometimes as a helium nucleus. Okay. So this one is simply your alpha particle. Okay. This is your alpha particle. Sorry. Okay. Now, in terms of geophysics, usually in geophysics, we are mostly interested in reading or in detecting or reading radioactivity, okay, from afar. Okay, commonly for radiometric methods, the most the most common one of the most common radiometric method in geophysics is the airborne radio spectroscopy. Okay, so what we usually do is we fly an airplane which can read out the radiation level, the spectra of intensities, okay, of radiation. Okay, and it is actually useful if the radioactive particles can actually travel long distances so that you can actually capture, okay, the subsurface. Okay, however, for alpha decay, the alpha particle can only travel a short distance, like a few centimeters in the air. Okay. And that simply means that it's physically almost impossible to capture alpha decay, okay, when you're using an airborne geophysical method. Okay. Okay. So this is not super useful for geophysics, okay? Although alpha decay is actually important for other um, niche or special applications. Okay? We're going to be talking about later. Okay? Now let's talk about the example of alpha decay, the decay of radon-222, or radon with an atomic weight of 222 into a plutonium with an atomic weight of 218. Okay. Okay. This decay, you only get radon gas when you have uranium-238. Okay. Radon gas is one of the products of the uranium, of the decay of uranium. So you have uranium-238, it decays into radium, which will later on decay into radon. Okay. If you look at the half-life of radon, it's comparatively really, really short compared to the half-life of radium or uranium. Okay, so what are we talking about when I say half-life? Okay, if you have a collection of atoms, let's say you have your atoms here. Okay, So let's say you have like maybe 100 atoms, okay, in this example. Okay. The half-life is the rate in which half of the atoms, okay, in this sample would decay into another isotope or another element. Okay. So for example, if you're talking about uranium-238, you have like one, let's say you start with 100 uranium atoms. So the half-life is 4.4 billion years. So after 4.4 billion years, this collection of 100 uranium atoms, okay, will approximately decay into 50, okay, atoms. I mean, 50 of them would undergo radioactive decay, okay, into radium, okay, while the other 50 would remain as uranium-238. Okay. Now, if you will look at radon, it has a very short half-life, which is every 3.8 days. So technically, radon does not really linger for long. Okay? When you have a radon, if you release some radon gas inside your house, for example, well, it will not stay for maybe a few days. Okay, so it has a half-life of 3.8 days. It will decay really quickly. However, the problem with radon is that if you have a source of radon, okay, it's gonna be emitted continuously, and it can radon gas. Of course, gas can travel through air, can also travel through soil, groundwater, and rock fractures. Okay. And one interesting fact about radon gas, is that it's one of the leading causes of lung cancer in the United States. Okay, so it's only second to cigarette smoking, okay, if you're talking about causes of lung cancer. Okay. So normally in the US, for example, they have radon testing kits, okay, which I think react with the radioactivity of the radon. Usually this works through the ionization of gases. We're gonna be talking about later on. And we have another example here. This is a research, in the Philippines, done on the Taal volcano. Okay, so they were Punong Bayan. I think these are people from PBOX. They were studying the radon gas in the soils in Taal volcano. And they actually detected an anomalous, okay, I mean, of course, anomalous, are talking about a sudden change, or drastic change. So there was a drastic increase in the radon in the soil around Tal Volcano just before the Mindoro earthquake in 1994. Okay. And this radon gas was detected using the ionization effect, okay, imparted by radon gas. So radioactive um, materials, okay, they involve a release of energy, okay, and this kind of energy can interact with or ionize or impart some electric charge to your to gases. Okay, so this principle is being exploited by radiometric detectors, for example, the Geiger counter. Okay. and also the radon gas detector, which was used in this study. Okay. So we're going to be talking about the Geiger counter later. Okay. So that those are the few applications of beta decay. Okay. The other mode of radioactive decay is your beta decay. So this is quite simple. You just have an electron that's being ejected by the atom. Okay. Okay. So the neutron splits into a proton and an electron is yeah. So you have a neutron here, which is actually splitting inside the nucleus. The proton is actually dissociating or splitting into two parts, a proton and an electron. Okay. So when this happens, the electron is actually ejected and the atom actually gains one proton. Okay. Okay. This happens because neutron actually consists of an electron and a proton. Okay. But this one is not counted when you're talking about atomic number. Okay. Only when the neutron dissociates into discrete particles of proton and neutron, it's the only time when you start counting the proton in the neutron. So therefore, in beta decay, you lose one electron and then you gain one proton. And of course, whenever there's a change in proton, on the number of proton, you have also a change in the atomic number, and there will also be a change in the type of the element, or there will be a transmutation. Okay. For the beta decay, one common example is the decay of carbon 14 into nitrogen 14. Okay. So carbon, okay, gains carbon 14 here gains one proton, so it actually transmutes into nitrogen 14, and you have an electron and an anti-neutrino being ejected during beta decay. Okay. Okay. So carbon 14, I'm sure if we're quite familiar with this one. This is actually important for the field or for the discipline of archaeology and paleontology. Okay. Okay, so carbon 14 again decays into nitrogen via the beta decay. And C14 or carbon 14 has a half-life of 5,700 years. Okay. All right. First, nitrogen. Where can we find it? This one is naturally produced in the atmosphere. Okay. So your carbon in the atmosphere, okay, when it is subject to radiation from the sun or cosmic radiation, okay, it actually produces. Okay, so actually, it can actually produce nitrogen 14. Okay, sorry. So you're talking about nitrogen in the atmosphere, which when subject to cosmic radiation can actually produce nitrogen 14, and then nitrogen 14 can actually transmute into carbon 14. Okay. And later on, carbon 14 can actually transmute back into nitrogen 14. Okay. So the point here is that you have a constant supply of carbon 14. Okay. And living organisms, of course, they consume a lot of carbon. Most of our food is composed of carbon atoms. However, once your organism dies, it's of course it ceases to have the ability to eat anything. So a dead horse cannot eat anything anymore. So it will stop consuming, or it will stop accumulating carbon 14. Okay? And when that happens, the collection of carbon 14 in the dead organism will now start to decay. Okay, because there's no source of replenishment. So okay, so the carbon 14 will now start to effectively decay or effectively undergo radioactive decay. And you can actually use carbon 14 dating for most organisms or most remains of organisms, and the effective dating range of C14 is 100 to approximately 50,000 years. Okay. So you also have gamma decay. Okay. And this one, your atom actually releases gamma rays. Okay. It's actually releasing energy. Okay. Gamma decay only involves the release of energy. It doesn't involve any release of particles or any. Unlike the previous ones where you eject, for example, helium nucleus in the alpha decay, and then for the beta decay, you eject an electron. In gamma decay, you only eject your gamma rays. And gamma ray is caused by gamma ray is just a step in the radioactive decay of most elements. So gamma decay usually happens when your nucleus, okay, is in a high energy state. Okay. So in order to stabilize, the nucleus will release a gamma ray. Okay, so it only changes the energy state. Okay, so it effectively lowers the energy state of the uh, atom. Okay, and since we're only talking about the release of energy, gamma decay does not involve any change in the number of protons or neutrons. Okay. So the common examples of gamma decay are your cobalt-60, cesium-137, and technetium-99. Okay. If you're gonna look at the diagram here, you have technetium, okay, technetium-99. Okay. When it undergoes gamma decay, okay, it goes from a high energy state into a lower energy state, and you only release a gamma ray. Okay. Cesium is actually an important proxy for detecting nuclear wastes from nuclear power plants and from nuclear weapons testing. Okay. So cesium-137 is just a product of the series of radioactive decay of uranium-235, which can decay into xenon-137 and eventually decay into cesium-137. Okay. So this is a good proxy. This is a commonly used proxy for detecting nuclear waste, from power plants or from weapons testing. Okay, let's have a quick trivia. The biggest, if you're gonna be looking at countries per capita, the biggest consumer or biggest generator of nuclear energy is France. Okay, so France actually, per person, about two-thirds, okay, of the energy needs are coming from nuclear power. And the closest, second closest one is Sweden, where about a third of their energy needs are produced by nuclear power. Okay, finally we have electron capture. Okay, so what happens here is your nucleus, which a proton-rich nucleus absorbs or it cannibalizes an inner orbital electron. So the nucleus, okay, a nucleus that has a lot of proton, of course, it has an excess positive charge. So it will tend to cannibalize an electron in order to stabilize. Okay. Okay. And of course, this process actually converts the proton, the excess proton, into a neutron. Okay. And therefore, there would be a change again in the number of the protons. So you lose a proton and add a neutron. Okay. But either way, the important detail here in electron capture is that there's a change in the number of protons, which will change the type of your element. For example, carbon 11 into boron 11. Probably the more important example is the more important example is the electron capture, decay of potassium 40 into argon 40. Okay. So potassium 40 actually transmutes into argon 40 through electron capture. Now let's talk about potassium. Potassium actually has three isotopes. Potassium 39 and potassium 41 are actually stable and they're actually more abundant. Okay. Among the three, the only one that's actually radioactive is potassium 40. Okay. And potassium 40 is actually one of the biggest, it's not the biggest source of radioactivity, but it's actually one of the biggest sources of radioactivity in the Earth. Okay. So if you have encountered the meme about bananas emitting or being radioactive, okay, so of course that's true. Okay, so bananas have potassium, and if your banana contains potassium 40, it's gonna be radioactive. Okay. So anyway, the largest sources of background radioactivity in the Earth is usually coming from uranium-235 and thorium-232, and you also have potassium 40. Actually potassium, at the present time, the biggest, probably the biggest source of radioactivity is thorium-232 and then followed by uranium-238 and then followed by potassium 40 and then uranium-235. Okay. Okay. And yeah, in geophysics, depending on your objective, potassium 40 can either be a signal or it can be a noise. Okay, so in geophysics, if you're looking for clays, okay, clays usually contain feldspars. Okay, so if you're looking for clays which were derived from potassium feldspars, okay, you can they can be radioactive to potassium if they contain potassium 40. Okay. Okay. However, if you're not looking for clays which contain potassium 40, then this one will be a noise. Okay, let's talk about go back again a bit to geophysics. Okay, so in geophysics, penetration is important. Okay, because penetration allows us to see deeper into the subsurface. Okay, so in this respect, alpha particles are actually the weakest. They have really weak penetration, followed by the beta particles. Okay, so they can only penetrate a few centimeters into different types of materials. The most the the radioactive particle with the greatest penetration is are the gamma rays. Okay, so they can penetrate to paper, aluminum, and through it's totally blocked by lead. Okay, for uh for practical purposes, gamma rays can only penetrate um I think approximately about zero point 0.1 meter into the soil. Okay. So if you are doing, for example, an airborne radiometric spectroscopy, you're only penetrating the upper 10 centimeters of the soil. Okay. So radiometric methods, especially airborne radiometric, is actually good for mapping soils, just mapping the surface soils. And this is actually useful for agriculture if you're trying to map out different kinds of soils. Okay, so again, clays are usually associated with potassium feldspars. Okay, so clays generally tend to be more radioactive than other types of soil. Okay, and these are just the different radioactive elements. Okay, the purple ones. Okay, let's talk about the yan dito. Okay, let's talk about the Geiger Muller counter. Okay. This is the favorite props for movies. Okay, when you have movies which have a theme on radioactivity. Okay, so this is the classic instrument which produces a creaking sound when it is near when it is in proximity of a radioactive source. Okay, so how does this work? So you basically have here a chamber. You have a chamber which contains a gas, and you have in the middle of the chamber is a metal. Okay. And what they do here is they apply a lot of voltage, okay, between the tube when between the walls of the tube and the electrode in the middle. Okay, so there's a lot of potential difference between these two. Okay. 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 However, they don't have an electric contact. Okay? They're not in electric contact. Now, once a radioactive particle or radioactive ray hits or passes through this gas inside your chamber, okay, it actually electrifies or ionizes the gas. Okay, so whenever something is ionized, it becomes conductive. Okay, and when something becomes conductive, electrons or electricity can actually flow. Okay, so whenever the gas becomes ionized, it becomes conductive, and it will register. So you have electricity flowing through here, and the intensity or the strength of the electricity is um is qualitatively measured by producing a sound. Okay, so whenever a radioactive particle hits the chamber of this one, it produces a sort of a creak or a beeping sound. Okay? And when you have a lot of particles, radioactive particles, hitting this chamber, it will have a rather continuous creaking sound. Okay, so let's try watching or try listening.
Stand out. Build in-demand Gen AI skills with Coursera. Reshape the way you work with AI and take your career to the next level. Explore more at Coursera.org.
Okay, so that's the sound of a Geiger counter. So each tap is usually caused by a radioactive particle hitting the gas chamber of your Geiger counter. Okay, and usually when you're closer to the source of the radioactivity, you will hear a lot of the creaking sounds will be more frequent. Okay. The next one is your scintillometer. Okay. This one works by the principle is quite similar to the Geiger counter, but instead of sound, you actually have a crystal here which reacts with radioactive particles. Okay. So this crystal is what we call a scintillating material. Whenever a radioactive ray or radioactive particle hits this material, it actually emits light. Okay. So the light emitted by this crystal is measured, okay, in the device, and the strength of the light, okay, is converted into the strength of the radioactivity. Okay. So the readings can be expressed in terms of either counts per second or microsieverts per hour or millirems per hour. So for reference, the dangerous level of radioactivity is 100 microsieverts per hour. Okay? Anything greater than that is dangerous for humans. You also have your gamma ray spectrometers. Okay? So when the keyword here is spectrometer, so it actually reads the different intensities of your radiation, and also counts the number of so it basically counts your radioactive particles or radioactive rays. So it counts their abundance and their corresponding intensities. Okay? So if you're gonna be plotting the number of gamma rays and versus the intensity of the gamma ray, okay, you can actually form, okay, if you're gonna be plotting it in on a count versus intensity plot, you can actually form a spectral pattern, and this one actually represents a signature. Okay, so in this chart you have different spectral signatures. These ones are usually established prior. Or these are mostly well-known or established signatures. Okay, so I'm gonna be highlighting them. So thorium here is more or less an established signature. Uranium and potassium. Okay, so these are the three most abundant sources of background radioactivity in the Earth. Okay, so what we do in gamma ray spectrometry is this one is usually done using an airborne instrument. So it's attached to an airplane, and then it senses the gamma rays being emitted by the soil or by the surface bedrock, okay, if it's a bedrock. But most of the time, you're gonna be measuring only the upper 10 centimeters of the soil. Okay? So the gamma ray spectrometer is gonna be counting the number of rays being emitted by the soil. Okay? And each ray that's emitted, okay, will have its corresponding intensity measured. Okay? So once you collect or count the gamma rays and then measure their individual energy intensities and you plot them on this chart. Okay, for example, if you have a granite gneiss area, you can eventually plot the signature, okay, of your material, and then you can compare it with the signatures of your common sources of radiation, namely thorium, uranium, and potassium. Okay? And from there, whatever signature is the most abundant in your soil, you can deduce, okay, what kind of material is present in your soil or bedrock. Okay, I'm not gonna be going deeper into that. Okay. Okay. And this is just another form of gamma. This is sort of a form of gamma ray spectrometry. But on a more simpler form, you have your gamma ray logging. So what they do here is I think they simply measure the intensity of the gamma rays, with respect to potassium radioactivity. So this one is focused on potassium-40 radiation, which in turn is potassium. Okay, potassium, which is common in potassium feldspars, which is the common product of clays, which clays usually have feldspars, which in turn has a lot of potassium. Okay, so clays are actually important for the oil and gas industry because the oil and gas industry actually is mostly interested in shales. Okay? They have important properties which trap oil and gas. Okay? So shales contain clays. So when you do gamma ray logging and you have a strong signature of potassium 40 radiation, you can relate it to the presence of shale layers, okay, which is actually important for oil and gas exploration. Spectral logging, sorry, this one is actually closer to the gamma ray spectrometry. So in spectral logging, you actually separate the radioactivity. So this one is done inside a borehole, sorry. So gamma ray logging is also done inside a borehole or a drilling log. So you drill into the subsurface and then you lower an instrument which can log the parameters as you travel down the hole. So gamma ray logging, you have an instrument which logs the gamma ray intensities. For spectral logging, this is also done inside the drill holes. And in this case, we actually separate the gamma ray energies contribute which can be attributed to thorium, uranium, and potassium. Okay. So you will notice that these are the three commonly common sources of radiation. So again, these are the three important sources of radiation: thorium, uranium, potassium. Okay, so uranium is actually, in a way, uranium is actually associated with organic matter. So again, I'm not completely familiar with that. So again, potassium, you're quite familiar with potassium. This one is attributed to clays. Okay. Thorium, I'm not completely familiar with thorium. Okay, and then you also have neutron logging. So in neutron logging, this is a bit different because technically you're not exactly looking at materials which are undergoing radioactive decay. Okay, so in neutron log, you're actually shooting neutron particles into the subsurface. Okay, and neutrons actually collide with hydrogen atoms. Okay, and neutrons lose a lot of energy whenever they collide with hydrogen atoms. So we can correlate the energy loss with the abundance of hydrogen. So hydrogen, okay, you have hydrogen from either water or from hydrocarbons like oil and gas. And the abundance of hydrogen can be used to estimate the porosity of your strata, which again, this is important for oil and gas exploration. Okay, so you can see here, um, you have gas here. You have gas, for example, here in a relatively porous formation, and then a slightly less porous. You have oil, and then brine or salt water. Okay. For environmental applications, okay, as I've discussed earlier, one of the common uses of gamma ray spec spectrometry is it's commonly implemented using an airborne configuration. Okay, so they fly an airplane and they read out the spectra of the gamma rays being emitted by the soil. So again, The sources of gamma ray would be related to the series of uranium or thorium or potassium. Okay. So actually, sorry, in here the penetration depth is actually deeper. So this is point. I think this one is 0.4 meters depth. Okay. So in here in this case study from Beckett 2008, this is a study in Australia. So if you're familiar with Australia, it's a very big land mass, and its area is almost equal to the total land area of Southeast Asia. Okay. So mapping the soils of Australia using conventional methods would be, of course, would be challenging. Okay. So instead, what they did is they actually used gamma ray spectrometry to distinguish, okay, the different types of soils. Okay. And they were able to use this method to map soils at scales of 1 is to 25,000 to even 1 is to 10,000. Okay. So the method was done using a 25 by 25 grid airborne survey with 256 channels. So if you say 256 channels, this is the increments. Okay? This is the number of increments. Okay? You have 256 gradations of the intensities. So it can separate the intensity of the gamma rays up to 256 intervals. Okay. So basically what they did here is they simply correlated, they looked at the signature of the soils, and then they just calibrated or correlated it with actual field types of the soils. Okay. You also have here an example. So in the US, they actually have a lot of nuclear wastes from weapons and nuclear power. And one of their dump sites for nuclear waste is the Farallon Islands, just near San Francisco. Okay, so they essentially dumped like 47,000 containers of radioactive waste between 1946 to 1970. Okay, and what they did here is they did a radiometric survey, okay, using a scintillometer system. So scintillometer can measure the intensity of radiation. And they also compared it with the cesium-137 contents of seawater. Okay, so I think the conclusion of the study is that they didn't find any regional or sort of leakage from the area. Okay, so the figure is black and white. It's not really so very clear. Okay, you also have radiometric methods being used for mineral exploration, for example, VMS. Okay, okay, most of the time, alteration halos or um, altered parts of the deposits, okay, can actually produce a lot of strong um, radioactive signatures, especially if you have potassic alteration. Okay. Same with epithermal gold. So as you're looking for potassic alteration, you can expect strong K40 signatures. Right? That's the conclusion of the lecture. Do you have questions or clarifications?